Now inside the I-based service interface, if you see, I'm using the iDisposable. And then if you examine here, we have the dispose method that has not been implemented. I won't go into the details here, but if you want to do something before disposing, you can do that here, as you can just say gc for garbage collection dot suppress finalize, and this will be true. If you wanted, you could have also ignored this iDisposable and dispose, but since we have added this, I will leave it at the bottom right here. That being said, let's work on the service, which is base service. Here we have the response model. We will not throw exception, but rather have the getter and setter. Next, when we have to make the request, we will be using the iHTTP client factory. You can also use iHTTP client, but with .NET Core, it is recommended to use the iHTTP client factory, which is inside system.net.http. I will call this as HTTP client, and we will get an implementation of this using dependency injection. So right here, we will get the iHTTP client factory, HTTP client, and we will say this dot response model. Let's first assign this a new response DTO, and this dot HTTP client is equal to HTTP client. Then we need to work on our main method, which is send async. We have the API request, which will have everything that we need for the API call. We will do that inside a try-catch block. That way, if we catch any exceptions, we can return the correct response. First thing we have to do is we need to create a client object using HTTP client.createClient, and we can pass a name here. We will call this Mango API. Now on that particular client that we created, we have to send an HTTP request message. So we'll say HTTP request message, message is equal to new, and HTTP request message. Now we need to configure this. So we'll say message.headers.add, and we will have the accept type as application, JSON. Since this is magic string, make sure that there is no spelling mistake here. We need to define the URI where this should be sent. So message.request URI is equal to new URI, and we need to pass the string that is inside API request. We have URL. Right now we are creating a generic method, so think about API request is completely populated when it is being called. We will do that in the upcoming videos, but for now assume that API request will have all the parameters that we need already populated. After that, on the client, if there are any default request headers, we will clear them out. So we'll have the dot clear. Then the data that we have inside the API request, we have to serialize that data. And it is not required that always there will be a data. So we will first check if API request has any data. So if this is not null, then we have to serialize that data and assign that to message.content. So we'll say new string content here. And in there we have to use JSON convert. We'll have to do a control dot here, and we have to install the NuGet package of newtonsoft.json. So we will select, find and install the latest version. Once that is done, on there we have the serialize object, and we will pass API request.data to that method. Then the string content has other parameters like encoding. So we'll say encoding, and we'll do control dot to include the using statement for system.text, and encoding type will use UTF-8, and lastly the media type is application/JSON. Again, make sure that there is no spelling mistake inside the magic strings. Once we have populated the data, we will get a response from the client. So we will get HTTP response message, and I will call this as API response, which will be null right now. Then we will scroll down and we need to write what is the type of the message. Is it a get, post, put, or delete? So I will add a switch case here and we will check that based on API request .api type. The first case here will be if API type .post. So if the method is post, then we'll say message.method is equal to HTTP method.post. After that, we will break out and I will copy this and paste that 3 more times. We will have put and we will have delete. Now, if it does not belong to any of these 3, then let's just implement a default case and assign that the method of get. Now this could have been simplified, but the reason I'm using a switch case is sometimes what you want to do is in case of post, you want to process something else along with just assigning the method. You can do everything inside this switch case. So perfect, things are looking good. Next we need to call the client and send the API. So we will get a response that will be in API response is equal to await. On the client object, we have the send async method. When we send async, we have to pass the HTTP request message, which is inside the variable message. Once we get a response back, we will have to convert or rather read it as a string. So we'll say variable API content is equal to await, and on the API response that we received, that will be content. We want to read that as string async, and then we have to deserialize that. So we'll say variable API response DTO is equal to, we will use the JSON convert dot deserialize object. The type that we will deserialize that will be generic. We will receive that when the method is called right here. So whatever object is defined there, we will convert it back to that object and we will pass the API content right here. Once we deserialize that, we will return back the API response DTO. Now, if there is an exception, what do? We will first create a variable DTO is equal to new response DTO. Then we will add a display message of error there, comma. We will have the error messages. This will be is equal to new list of string. And what we will pass here is convert.toString the complete exception. So ex.message, e.message. Lastly, we will define the isSuccess to be false. Once we do that, then we can do variable res is equal to JSON convert dot serialize that object to a DTO. This will be variable, and we will say variable API response DTO is equal to JSON convert dot deserialize object, and we'll deserialize that to a generic object which will be from the response, and we will return back the API response DTO. Now you might be wondering on what I am doing here. I'm serializing and then deserializing again. Well, it is not required here because we know that the type that we will be calling on will be the API response DTO. But I'd like to make it generic, that's why I did that, so that even if you had some other object, it will try to convert it back. If it fails, then it fails. So again, this is not a required step if you are using the same response DTO every time. Once you accomplish this, you will see there are few errors. The reason is we do not have the async keyword inside our method. Once you add that, everything goes away. Perfect. So it took us a while to implement the generic method, but if you think about the advantages that it brings, it's tremendous. If you did not have this base service, then whenever you were making a call, let's say inside the product service for all the 5 methods, you would have to write something similar every time, and that is very time consuming as well as redundant code that you should avoid. So perfect, our base service looks good. Let's continue in the next video.